Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
During Passover dinner, as we passed the parsley and poured the wine, my father raised his glass with that overconfident smirk he always wore when he thought he was about to deliver one of his golden lines, the kind that he believed would one day be etched in family lore, as if his dinner toasts were worth quoting. "To Ethan," he said, loud enough for the whole damn table to hear over the clinking cutlery and muffled small talk, "our family's entrepreneur. He's building a startup." He paused for dramatic effect, then turned toward me with mock innocence in his voice and that tired, familiar sting in his words. "Why can't you be more like him, Rachel?" The laugh that followed was meant to be casual, but it landed like a slap. That was his way. Laugh when you insult someone, and somehow it doesn't count as cruelty. I didn't look at him right away. Instead, I let my eyes scan the table, Uncle Dan sipping his Manischewitz like it was the first real wine he'd ever tasted, Aunt Linda dabbing invisible crumbs from her blouse with a cloth napkin, my mother fiddling with the candlesticks to avoid eye contact. And then Ethan, sitting at the head of the table like a prince being knighted, soaking in the admiration, nodding modestly as if he hadn't been spoon-fed validation his whole damn life. I saw the corner of his mouth twitch when Dad mentioned the startup. A little nervous smile. Like he'd forgotten how fragile his house of cards really was. So I smiled. Not wide. Just enough. And said, "Funny, he works for me now." Didn't think it was worth mentioning. And just like that, everything stopped. The air tightened. The laughter choked. The sound of chewing ceased. Forks hovered midair like suspended accusations. My father blinked, as if he hadn't heard me right. Ethan's grin faltered like a light bulb flickering before it dies. And in that sudden, gasping silence, I felt something shift, not just in the room, but deep inside me. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for approval. I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. I wasn't playing nice. But let's rewind for a second. This didn't happen overnight. You don't humiliate your brother in front of the entire extended family at a religious dinner out of nowhere, not unless something's been festering. Not unless you've spent your entire life being invisible, being quiet, being told that you should be grateful just to be at the table. I was the firstborn, yes, but from the moment Ethan could walk and talk and charm a room, I became the shadow. My childhood was a slow accumulation of small dismissals. "Ethan's so good at math," my dad would say while I was silently reading novels twice my grade level. "He's a leader," he'd brag when Ethan organized a garage band that lasted 3 weeks. When I got into Stanford, the first thing my father said was, "That's pretty far, isn't it? You sure you can manage that on your own?" But when Ethan got into a local business program 3 years later, my dad nearly wept from pride. The thing is, I didn't rebel. I didn't argue. I didn't try to prove him wrong. I just left. I went to Stanford. I graduated. I worked in tech. I made mistakes, got burned, got smarter. At 29, I left a job where I'd been passed over for a younger man with a louder voice and fewer ideas. I took that bitterness and built something from it. I started my own company, not flashy, not something that would show up in TechCrunch headlines, but solid. Real. Bootstrapped. And I never told my family. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew what they'd do with the information. They'd twist it into a compliment for Ethan somehow. It was 6 months ago when I saw Ethan's resume come across my desk. I didn't recognize it at first. He applied under a slightly different name, no mention of family, just a generic application sent through a recruiter. The role was mid-level ops. Nothing glamorous. My co-founder, Alex, reviewed it first and flagged it as a maybe. "Solid background," he said. "Bit of a showboat, though." That made me laugh. I looked at the name again. Ethan Klein. And then it clicked. I told Alex I'd take the interview personally. I wanted to see how long it would take him to realize who he was talking to. He didn't. Not during the video call, not during the onboarding, not even during his first 2 months. He worked for my company, my rules, my systems, my investors. And not once did he ask who was behind it all. He answered to Alex, who he assumed was the CEO. Because Alex is loud. He's tall. He has a beard and talks in jargon. Ethan sees someone like that and thinks, "There's the boss." And that's the problem with men like him and my father. They never consider the possibility that the quiet one in the corner might be the one pulling all the strings. At first, I thought about telling him. Just casually, maybe in a meeting, maybe over Slack. But then I realized no, that wasn't the right move. I wanted him to build his little sandcastle, to decorate it with lies and half-truths, to brag about it over matzo ball soup and cheap wine, to stand up at dinner and say, "I'm building something," like he'd just reinvented the wheel. I wanted him to be the hero in his own story for just long enough, so that when the truth landed, it landed hard. And that brings us back to the table. To my father's smug toast. To the clinking glasses and the self-satisfied laughter. To the question, why can't you be more like him? And to my answer, the quiet, calm, surgical truth that split the room open. What followed was the kind of silence that only decades of denial can create. You could feel it thick and suffocating, like smoke in a sealed room. My father's face was frozen, the color draining slowly like a Polaroid in reverse. Ethan looked like a man who had just watched his house burn down and couldn't figure out how the fire started. No one spoke. Not for a solid 30 seconds. And in those 30 seconds, I felt more powerful than I had in my entire life. But here's the thing about revenge, it's only the beginning. And I wasn't done yet. The thing about Ethan is that he never learned to question whether the applause he heard was real or just the echo of his own voice bouncing off the walls of a family that needed him to be special more than he ever actually was. From the time we were kids, he walked through life like the pavement rolled itself out beneath his feet, always assuming that every compliment was earned, every success deserved, every door opened because he knocked, and never because someone else had unlatched it for him. I never hated him for it, at least not then. How can you hate someone for being handed a script and simply reading his lines with the confidence of someone who's never had to improvise? But over the years, especially after he started describing himself as a visionary, while working a series of forgettable product management jobs, that old irritation evolved into something sharper. Something that felt a little like pity, but had a bitterness to it that couldn't be ignored. It was exactly 6 months before the dinner that his name showed up on our list of shortlisted applicants, nestled between two guys from lesser-known logistics startups and one former Amazon guy who clearly lied about half his resume. At first, I didn't believe it was him. The name was common enough, and there was no mention of family ties or even any location info that would have connected him to me directly. The recruiter had flagged him because his experience sort of aligned with a role we were filling, a new operations lead who could interface between vendors, tech, and fulfillment partners for a project we were scaling fast, but still keeping quiet externally. My co-founder, Alex, who handled most of the hiring side at that stage, tossed the profile my way, saying, "Bit flashy on LinkedIn, but he checks some of the boxes, worth a chat." I still remember staring at the file, scrolling through the bullet points written in that half-bragging, half-buzzword soup that every mediocre tech bro seems to perfect by 30. Team leader with agile implementation skills. Cross-functional strategist. Culture builder. Nothing concrete. Nothing that screamed doer. But something about the phrasing struck me, and when I saw the portfolio link, one I recognized from a domain Ethan had tried to get off the ground during lockdown, I knew. My brother, the golden boy, was knocking at my door without even knowing whose building he was trying to enter. I didn't say a word to Alex. I scheduled the interview myself, told him I had a hunch I wanted to explore. The call was short, maybe 20 minutes tops. Ethan didn't recognize me. I was off camera, audio only, under a generic admin name we used internally. I asked him some basic process questions, probed his problem-solving approach, threw a few technical curveballs just to see how deep the bullshit ran. He handled it exactly like I expected, polished, rehearsed, and utterly empty of substance. He didn't mention anything about his previous layoffs, nor did he ask a single question about who the founders were. That last part stayed with me. If you're applying to a young company and you don't even care who's running it, you're either too lazy or too arrogant to believe it matters. We hired him. Not out of spite, at least not yet, but because we genuinely needed someone in that role, and I was curious how long it would take him to either sink or start bragging. He joined the team 2 weeks later, onboarding through our standard process, given access to a Slack workspace, an email address, and a handbook he clearly skimmed. From day one, he assumed Alex was the CEO. The dynamic confirmed everything I'd ever known about Ethan's perception of the world, that the tallest man in the room with the firmest handshake must be the one in charge, and the woman behind the scenes, calm, quiet, efficient, must be his assistant. For the next couple months, I watched from a distance. I didn't micromanage him, didn't even interact much. We had layers of management in place for that, and I trusted the people we'd built the company with to handle day-to-day issues. But it wasn't long before complaints began to surface. Ethan was charismatic, no doubt, clients liked him, partners found him charming, but internally, he was a drain. He missed deliverables, gave vague status updates, and blamed delays on everyone but himself. One junior team member came to Alex after a meeting, saying, "He talks like a VP, but he doesn't do anything." That one sentence stuck with me more than any quarterly report. Still, I waited. I let him brag in the group chats. I watched him host a Zoom happy hour and take credit for a system he barely understood. And when I saw, on his public LinkedIn page, that he'd updated his title to Founding Team, Stealth Startup, I laughed. Out loud. In my kitchen. Alone. It was such a perfect distillation of him, claiming founder status at a company he didn't even know belonged to his sister. The irony was surgical. The arrogance, textbook. What he didn't realize was that by overplaying his hand, he was giving me a script I never had to write myself. The more he positioned himself as the genius behind the curtain, the more devastating the reveal would be when the curtain finally dropped. And while he was out there spinning stories, I was closing real deals. Investors were starting to notice. Our product, still under wraps to the public, was performing better than projections. And behind the scenes, my name was on every contract, every equity agreement, every cap table. Then came the week of the Series A announcement. We'd raised a healthy round, nothing world-shattering, but enough to secure runway, hire another engineering team, and get a serious PR strategy in place for launch. The investor email went out internally, with all team members copied for transparency. I watched the Slack notifications fire in real time. Congratulations. Fire emojis. Fist bumps. Ethan responded in the thread with a proud to be part of this ride message, like he'd just been knighted again. What he didn't notice, what most of the team did, is that the announcement was signed by me. Rachel Klein, CEO and co-founder. Clear. In bold. Right there. He didn't say a word about it. Not that day. Not the next. I don't know if he saw it and buried the panic, or if his ego simply protected him like it always had, by convincing him he was still in control. Either way, the wheels were turning now. And I wasn't going to hit the brakes. I'd waited too long. Bit my tongue too often. Let him soak in unearned praise while I built quietly, diligently, intentionally. So when Passover crept up, and I received the group email from my mother asking if I'd be attending, I said yes. And I smiled to myself, because I already knew how the night would end, not with shouting or accusations or broken plates, but with one clean sentence that would cut through the room like a scalpel through silk. Ethan had built his house on sand, and he'd invited the whole family to admire the view. All I had to do was wait for the tide. There's something almost grotesquely theatrical about Passover at my parents' house, a strange blend of tradition and performance. As though the ritual itself has less to do with honoring the Exodus and more to do with showcasing the version of family my father insists on staging, one where every chair has its assigned role, every person their line, and every truth must be bent until it fits the neat, palatable shape of what he calls family unity, which in practice means silence, compliance, and above all, never contradicting the narrative he's spent a lifetime constructing. The dining room, always too brightly lit and too heavy with overcooked expectations, hadn't changed since I was a teenager. Same ornate chandelier, same fake antique mirror on the far wall that always seemed to reflect everyone at their worst angles, and the same massive mahogany table, polished within an inch of its life, stretching long enough to seat 12 and still leave room for everyone's egos to breathe comfortably. By the time I arrived, the guests had already begun to fill their usual spots. Uncle Dan, who still thought the stock market was a religion and Warren Buffett a prophet, was already loudly explaining the impending correction to no one in particular, while Aunt Linda chirped over him, complaining about the price of avocados and how millennials were ruining coffee. My mother fluttered between the kitchen and the table like a ghost trapped in her own house, fussing over silverware and refolding napkins that had already been folded perfectly fine the first time. Ethan, of course, had claimed the seat to my father's right, where he sat with the air of someone expecting to be toasted before the soup was even served, his blazer slightly too tight around the shoulders. Either a poor tailoring choice or the weight of his own delusions finally catching up with him. When I walked in, the reaction was almost amusing in its restraint. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, a few surprised "oh, you made it" remarks that thinly veiled the expectation that I probably wouldn't, or maybe shouldn't have. My mother kissed my cheek too fast, and I could feel the tension in her arms as she pulled back. My father gave me a nod, which for him counted as an emotional outpouring. And Ethan barely looked up from his phone, muttering, "Hey, Ratch," like we hadn't seen each other in 6 months, and like I hadn't been signing his paychecks for 4 of them. As we sat down and the prayers began, the old cadence of family obligation took over. My father's booming voice led the Seder, skipping over the parts he always found boring, emphasizing the sections where he could inject moral lessons disguised as thinly veiled criticisms. "We were once slaves in Egypt," he read aloud, pausing meaningfully, then glancing across the table toward me as he added, "and freedom doesn't just mean leaving the desert. It means having a direction, a purpose, a plan." The implication hung there like smoke. Some people wander. Some people build. And we all knew which camp he thought I belonged in. But I didn't respond. Not yet. I passed the bitter herbs, recited the blessings, dipped the parsley in salt water, and waited. Because I knew, with a certainty that came from years of watching this man perform, that he wouldn't be able to help himself. Eventually, he'd set the stage. Eventually, he'd cue the moment. And when he did, I'd be ready. It happened somewhere between the gefilte fish and the brisket. Glasses had been refilled, the room was warm with wine and familiarity, and the conversation had finally started to unravel from religious tradition into casual boasting. That's when my father lifted his glass, dramatic as ever, and said the line I knew he'd been rehearsing in his head since the moment I walked in, to Ethan, our family's entrepreneur. "He's building a startup." There was polite applause, a few raised eyebrows from family friends, and Ethan, never one to downplay admiration, nodded like a man accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award. And then, with the timing of a comedian who'd already tested the joke in several variations, my father turned to me with that smug, familiar grin and said, "Why can't you be more like him, Rachel?" The laughter that followed was light, almost forced, but it still landed like a punch. That laugh wasn't about humor. It was about compliance. It was a reminder, a tap on the nose with a rolled-up newspaper. Stay in your lane. Be the disappointment quietly. And then I spoke. Not loudly. Not bitterly. Just enough. "Funny," I said, laying down my fork carefully. "He works for me now." Didn't think it was worth mentioning. You could almost hear the air leaving the room. Not a gasp, not an exclamation, just the eerie stillness that comes when an engine stalls at high speed, and everyone realizes they've been moving without noticing the cliff just ahead. My father blinked. My mother froze mid-sip. Ethan's smile collapsed into something much closer to fear, or at least confusion. Uncle Dan coughed. Aunt Linda whispered, "Excuse me." Ethan looked at me like I'd just spoken in another language, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I'd have to spell it out. "I'm the CEO," I continued, my voice as calm as it had been when I'd reviewed his underwhelming performance reports the week before, "of the company Ethan's been working at for the last 4 months. He applied under a different name. Never asked who founded it. Never asked who ran it. He just assumed." My father's face was unreadable at first, a mask of confusion trying to keep up with too many variables at once. But slowly, The recognition seeped in, and with it, the anger, not just at the fact itself, but at the loss of narrative control. He'd crafted Ethan as the chosen one, the heir, the future of our family's imagined legacy. And now, in one sentence, I'd not only disrupted that image, I'd replaced it. Ethan tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. Wait, are you serious? I didn't answer. I just took another sip of wine. There was a beat of silence. And then another. And then my father's voice, measured, cold, furious beneath the surface. You mean to tell me you knew this whole time, and you didn't say anything? You let us believe. I didn't let you believe anything, I interrupted, still not raising my voice. You believed what you wanted. You always have. He looked like he might explode. His hands clenched the arms of his chair. That was cruel. That was manipulative. And maybe it was. Maybe waiting for this moment, saving it like a card up my sleeve, letting it detonate during dinner, maybe that wasn't kind. But kindness, I've learned, is too often confused with silence. And I had been silent for too long. The others began to shift in their seats, their eyes darting between us like a tennis match they hadn't asked to attend. My mother reached out to touch my arm, gently, as if trying to call me back to some middle ground that never really existed. Rachel, she whispered, maybe we can talk about this later. But I shook her off, not unkindly, just firmly. No, we're talking about it now. You all sat here year after year pretending Ethan was something he's not and pretending I was something less. You never asked what I did, what I built, what I sacrificed. You just assumed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. The kind of silence that reveals more than any shouting match ever could. And in that silence, I knew I'd broken something, not just a moment, not just a dinner, but a long-held illusion that had propped up our family's sense of balance for years. And the most beautiful part? I wasn't sorry. Not even a little. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't performing. I wasn't seeking approval. I wasn't being the quiet one. I was just being exactly who I'd always been. And now, they had no choice but to see it. There's a peculiar kind of silence that descends not when people are processing something trivial or simply unexpected, but when the reality they've carefully constructed for years begins to disintegrate in real time, and all that remains is the dull, terrifying echo of their own denial finally giving way to the truth. That was the silence that blanketed the table after I spoke, dense, pressurized, and utterly inescapable, as though the walls themselves had contracted inward around us, suffocating any attempt at laughter or casual recovery. It was the kind of silence that makes even the clink of a fork against a plate sound like an intrusion. Ethan sat frozen, blinking as if someone had slapped him across the face, and he wasn't sure whether to get angry or apologize. He looked smaller somehow, slouched slightly, suddenly unsure of the ground beneath him, like a child who's just realized that the game he's been playing wasn't a game at all. My father, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair with the posture of a man who'd just been publicly stripped of a medal he never earned but always paraded around like it was tattooed on his chest. The red slowly crept up his neck, not from embarrassment, he was far too proud for that, but from fury, the kind that brews beneath the surface when control has slipped through your fingers and there's no one left to blame but the mirror you refuse to look into. For a few agonizing moments, no one spoke. The guests, those poor souls who had simply come for brisket and wine, shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to offer a polite smile, excuse themselves, or pretend they hadn't just witnessed a generational shift in power dynamics happen right in front of them. My mother, God bless her, tried to salvage the evening by murmuring something about dessert and reaching for the serving spoons as though a slice of sponge cake could put a cork in the emotional chasm that had cracked wide open across the table. But I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone deliberately, methodically, and tapped open the company's website. With a few swipes, I navigated to the About Us section, then turned the screen to face the table, positioning it squarely in front of Ethan and, by extension, everyone else. My name sat at the top, under the title Co-founder and CEO. My photo stared back at them, professional, poised, unmistakably me. The silence deepened, this time tinged with disbelief that quickly calcified into something harder, something colder. I didn't hide it, I said, my voice steady, controlled. It was there. You just never looked. He never looked. And none of you ever asked. Ethan reached for the phone, his fingers hesitating midair before touching the screen, as if the image might somehow change if he tapped it enough times. He muttered something under his breath, too low to catch, then looked up, his voice dry and thin. Why wouldn't you tell me? There it was, the question. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just bewildered, as if the betrayal wasn't that he'd lied to everyone about his role in the company, but that I hadn't taken the time to correct his narrative for him. I met his gaze without flinching. Because you never asked. You assumed. From the minute you walked in that door, you assumed Alex was in charge. You assumed I was nothing. You assumed, because that's what you've always done. I gave you the opportunity to prove who you were without the safety net of family privilege, and you failed, not because you're incapable, but because you think charm is a substitute for substance. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his expression slipping from confusion to something resembling shame. But my father, ever the showman, couldn't let the scene pass without reclaiming the spotlight. He leaned forward, his voice low but sharp, each word clipped like it had been honed on a whetstone of disappointment. You humiliated your brother. Your own family. In front of guests. On a holy night. No, I said, calmly, what humiliated him was the truth. What humiliated him was pretending to be someone he's not in a room full of people who only ever cared about the image, not the effort. He scoffed, dismissive, and turned to the guests like he was seeking an audience to validate his wounded pride. She always did think she was smarter than everyone else. It would have been easy to lash out then, to catalog the years of slights and passive-aggressive insults, to remind him how many times he'd reduced my accomplishments to luck or good timing, while Ethan's mediocrity was treated like destiny. But instead, I smiled, slow, deliberate, cutting. No, I said, I never thought I was smarter. I just stopped pretending you were right. And with that, I stood up. My mother reached for my hand as I passed, her fingers soft but desperate, her eyes wide with a silent plea, not for me to apologize, but for me to make it all go away, to rewind the tape and smile like none of this had happened. Rachel, she whispered, couldn't you have just told us? Quietly? Privately? And that question, more than anything else, confirmed what I had always suspected. It wasn't about the truth. It was about preserving the illusion. It was about not embarrassing the people who'd been content to ignore me until my silence became inconvenient. I tried quiet, I said, pulling my hand gently from hers. All it got me was a seat at the kids' table. Then I walked out, leaving behind the sound of my father's indignation rising and the brittle clinking of glassware being cleared by hands that still didn't know what to do. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry in the driveway. I didn't text a friend for validation or replay the moment on loop looking for flaws in my delivery. I just walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and exhaled for the first time in years, maybe ever, as if my lungs had been holding onto a lifetime of swallowed words, and finally, mercifully, I'd let them go. The thing no one ever tells you about standing up to family is that it doesn't feel triumphant. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like mourning. Like burying a version of yourself you were forced to carry because everyone else needed you to be smaller, quieter, more palatable. It feels like shedding skin you never agreed to wear. And when it's done, when the dust has settled and the last bite of dessert has been eaten in awkward silence, all you're left with is the question of what kind of person you'll become now that you've stopped pretending. But I wasn't interested in their grief. Not anymore. Because my story wasn't about their discomfort. It was about my emergence. And I wasn't going back in. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear much from anyone, not a single call from my mother, who used to check in every few days even if just to passively ask about my eating habits or offer unsolicited advice about dating someone more settled. And no group texts from the family thread where Ethan normally dropped half-baked motivational quotes or photos of himself grinning beside forgettable men in unbuttoned shirts at half-empty startup mixers, and certainly nothing from my father, who, I imagined, was either licking his wounds or rewriting the narrative in his head until he could find a version of events where he still came out on top, where I was still the rebellious daughter who didn't understand the value of humility, and where Ethan, despite all evidence, was still the pride of the family. The absence of noise, though, wasn't peace. It was something else entirely. It was the eerie quiet that settles after an explosion, when everything looks strangely intact until you realize the foundation has been obliterated, and all that remains is a structure waiting to collapse from the inside out. At work, things moved faster than ever. The investor round had brought not only money but attention. Strategic partners came knocking, unsolicited resumes from highly qualified talent began flooding in, and press inquiries started showing up in my inbox, demanding statements, interviews. A chance to feature the story of a female founder defying the odds, which, frankly, I found more exhausting than flattering. I didn't need to be their headline or their exception. I just wanted to build something real, something that didn't need to scream to be seen. And yet, despite all the momentum, a small part of me, some bitter, weathered shard left over from the girl who once waited quietly at the edge of the table, still wondered if the silence from my family was really the price of finally being heard. It wasn't until the third week after the dinner that I saw Ethan's name appear on my phone again, this time not as an employee responding to a Slack message, but as a missed call, followed by a text that said only, "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. Not immediately. Not even later that night when I reread the message a second, then a third time, trying to discern the tone behind those 3 words. Was it remorse, panic, defiance, desperation? I couldn't tell. And I wasn't sure I cared. But the universe has a way of testing your resolve when you've finally found your center, and just as I was preparing for a board meeting the following Monday morning, with a thick dossier in my hand and a bulletproof roadmap in my head, the receptionist messaged me that someone named Martin Klein was in the lobby, unannounced, asking to see me. It took me a full minute to respond. Not because I was surprised, my father showing up out of nowhere was very much in character, especially after having been so thoroughly embarrassed, but because I realized I felt absolutely nothing. No dread. No thrill. Just an odd curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen that once terrified her but now seemed rather small in its glass box. He was sitting in one of the full-leather lobby chairs, posture stiff, arms crossed like he was waiting to be summoned to a courtroom rather than a daughter's office. He looked older than I remembered, though not in any dramatic physical way. His hair was still thick and meticulously parted, his shoes still polished, his blazer still perfectly tailored, but there was something diminished in him, a tightness around the jaw, a hesitation in the eyes, as if the performance was faltering under the weight of something he wasn't used to carrying, doubt. I didn't offer a handshake. I didn't ask him to sit. I just stood at the threshold of the conference room and said, "You have 5 minutes." He exhaled through his nose, the way he always did when he was deciding between self-righteous anger and fake diplomacy, and said, "Ethan's struggling. He's confused. He's lost some opportunities because of how things went down. He's not himself." I didn't respond. I waited, because I knew there was more, and I knew he hated having to say it. He needs work. He needs structure. Another shot. He paused, then looked at me as if he expected this next line to soften me. "He respects you, you know. He talks about how driven you are. How smart." There it was. The offer wrapped in flattery, a little rusted around the edges, but delivered with just enough sincerity to make me laugh under my breath. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. This man who had ignored everything I'd done, who had treated my silence as failure, now standing in the very building that bore the fruits of that silence, asking me to lift his golden boy back onto the pedestal he never earned. "I run a company," I said slowly, deliberately, "not a rehabilitation center for fragile egos." My father flinched barely, then recovered. "You'd let your brother sink just to prove a point?" I met his gaze steady. "No. I let him sink because he never learned how to swim." He stood up then, fast, like the room itself had insulted him. "This isn't you. You're being cold. Vindictive." "No," I said, "I'm being fair. You just never noticed, because fairness always looked like favoritism when it wasn't working in your favor." He left without another word, and I watched him go, not with satisfaction, not with sadness, but with a kind of clarity I hadn't known I'd been craving for years. He would go home, no doubt twist the story into something palatable for himself, maybe tell my mother I was bitter or power-drunk or still incapable of forgiveness. And she would listen, nodding quietly, stirring tea she didn't want, wondering how it had come to this, but never asking the question aloud. Later that night, I checked my voicemail. There was a message from Ethan, his voice subdued, almost cracked around the edges. Hey, I messed up. I know that now. Just call me back, okay? Please. I sat with that message longer than I expected, letting it replay once before pressing delete. The next morning, I walked into our board meeting, laid out our growth projections, and spoke with the confidence of someone who no longer needed validation from the people who'd built their love on conditions. My team listened, engaged, respected every word not because they had to, but because I'd earned that place at the table on my own terms, without theatrics, without compromise. As the meeting wrapped, I stood by the window, looking out over a skyline that had never felt like home until now, and thought about how strange it was to spend most of your life waiting to be seen by people whose vision was always blurred by expectation, only to find that once you stopped seeking their gaze, you became impossible to ignore. I didn't know what would happen with Ethan, or with my parents, or whether the family thread would ever light up again with shared recipes and off-key holiday photos. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never sit at a table again where I had to earn my place with silence. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only victory I ever needed.